Hi there, Booktube. It's Roz, and I'm here to give you a little kind of wrap up and summary of things that I read in January and what were the highlights and the delights and the what was not so good. Well, actually, it was a pretty sound month again, but that's because I choose carefully, as you know. Now, this month I had a wonderful reread. 4 collections of poetry, 2 of which were good and 2 of which were like stellar. I'll tell you about. I read an intriguing play, a non-fiction book that I've been meaning to read for donkey's years, and 6 really interesting novels. 3 originally published in English and 3 that I read in translation. So, where should we start? Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that most months I'll have done some individual videos, standalone reviews maybe or whatever about some of the things that I'm talking about, but I haven't this month. Couple of reasons for that. One is that at the beginning of the month I was doing my sort of reflections on 2024, and that sort of took up all my filming time and energy. And the other reason is that January has been a bit of a tricky month from a work point of view, which I won't talk about, but it's just, something has to give. And I never want to stop reading, so if anything's going to give, it's probably making videos. I have done one kind of booktubey thing that I have never done before this month, and that's host a live show. That was yesterday when I'm recording this. I'll probably put it out a bit later in the week. And that was about Clean by Alia Trabucco Zerán, a novel that she published in Spanish in 2022. She's Chilean, and the English translation came out in 2024 by Sophie Hughes, and that's what I read. Now, I did a live show about that because it was the January book for the reading, the year-long reading eventy thing that I'm hosting together with Katja of Page Turners with Katja, and it's the thread that I'm helping host is kind of recent contemporary global fiction, in translation. Although some people might read some of them in their original language. 12 books, and this was our first. I was terrified doing a live show, but actually it was fine, and thank you everyone who came. But because I've done that, I won't say a lot about the book. But it's kind of described as a literary thriller, but it isn't really that. It's more of a psychological novel with a first-person unreliable narrator to carry you through it, and you start by hearing about that a child has died, but it's more complicated than that. It's, in many ways, it's a kind of a delving into an expose of the inequality of Chilean society still. Well worth reading, not a perfect book, but really interesting and, as I say, quite gripping. So, and if you're really curious, have a look at the live show, which is of course available. It's a bit long though to watch the whole thing. I think if you're not taking part, I don't know. See what you think. Now, I've also been reading another book by a South American author that's sort of described as crime or a crime writer, although she isn't always, and that's Claudia Piñeiro. This one, the January one, A Crack in the Wall, is, I suppose, closer to the sort of traditional crime novel sort of style than some of her books that I've read. This one came out in 2009 in Argentina, where she's from. And the English translation that I read was by Miranda, France, and came out in 2013. And I'm reading this with a lovely group of women, the Piñeiro Project group, and all women actually. Brian's with us too, Brian of Bookish. And this, I would say, very effective crime fiction. interesting characters, not always likeable, but that doesn't matter. The city of Buenos Aires is a real kind of a character in itself in this book. But I would say of the Piñeiros that I've read up to now, this is not on the same level as like Elena Knows or A Little Luck or Time of the Flies. So I'm not going to dwell on that one, because I would rather move on to another novel that I read in translation, which was a real stunner. And that's this one, Dealing with the Dead by Alain Mabanckou. Now, and this was translated by Helen Stevenson. Now, Mabanckou, if you don't know him, is the best known writer from Congo. That's Congo Brazzaville, or the Republic of Congo, not the Democratic Republic of Congo that's anything but democratic and used to be called Zaire. So it's a smaller country called Congo that's just to the north of it. And he has been living in exile for many years in France and the United States, but he still writes about the Congo. That's where his heart is, and that's where his novels tend to be set. He is such a striking and fascinating writer. This is the second of his novels that I've read, and I'm sure it won't be the last. It was published in French in 2022, but this translation into English is hot off the press. It came out in 2025. So new and exciting, and I was glad that my wonderful library service was able to supply me with it. It's, how to describe it, his writing's kind of political, strongly political, but not, always through stories, through plot, through events. There's a satirical kind of quality. I mean, like the things that happen and the people in his books tend to be larger than life in a way, and the situations kind of odd or unsettling, I suppose, is a good word to describe them. This one is we're hearing the story of a young man, only 24, and R.U.R, and he's just died. We don't, at the beginning of the book, know how or why, but we know that he's recently deceased, and he's kind of come, well, not necessarily back to life, because he's definitely dead, but he's sort of pops up 4 days after his death, the in the night after his burial, and then we get him kind of thinking back. He sort of kind of dreams the 4 days of his funeral, or sees them in a dream, and then he meets a series of other people in the cemetery where his body was buried, and finds out kind of their stories, and that kind of does some complicated context setting, but also trying to initiate him into the life of the dead. And then he chooses to leave the cemetery and go back and revisit where he spent his last couple of days, and we find the story of his final days and how he came to die. I find it quite hard to do justice to a book like this, because it's both serious and funny. It's both kind of a bit, it's about kind of a ghost, so odd, and yet brutally realist in other ways, because it's about what it's like living in Pointe Noire, the Congolese coastal city. It's how political corruption kind of shapes people's lives there every day, but also the kind of the vigor and solidarity and energy of the place and the culture. So one to read and see what you think. But you know that one of the things that I really like is a book that is both odd and yet readable. And this is absolutely, that's the area that this is in. So, the other thing in translation that I read this month, to talk about that, we have to go way back now to the 1920s, because I read a play by Karel Čapek, I think that's how it's pronounced, which was written in the 1920s. I read a translation into English from the 1980s by Claudia Novack Jones. There's a few translations around. The play is called R.U.R, or Rossum's Universal Robots. And it's the play that we get the word robot from. It's about the risks of inventing and manufacturing and selling humanoid robots, that look and sound and feel like humans but aren't. So it's got resonances for the current day, for artificial intelligence and robotics. It's absolutely fascinating. It's not the best play that I've read in sort of literary or theatrical terms, but just the idea is splendid. So thank you to Angelia of Reads and Rereads for her endless drama kind of read-along event that made me read this play. Now, let's move on to the poetry that I read this month, because this was an unusual month for me, as I say, in that I read, I might read one or two, bits of poetry in any given month. This month, I happened to read 4, and 2 were good, and 2 were really exceptional of these 4 collections. So I'll give you the good ones fairly swiftly, and then move on to the 2 really special ones. And I know, poetry is a bit of a niche thing, but the 2 really special ones, I'm really going to urge you, if you had the slightest interest in poetry, to consider reading. Now, the good ones then. Good number 1 was Picasso, I Want My Face Back by Grace Nichols. She's a British Guyanese poet. She lives quite near me, about 10 miles away in Lewis, but she grew up in Guyana, British Guyana, as was. This collection is from 2009. So why was I reading it now in 2025? I'll tell you why. Because in 2024, for one reason or another, I kept hearing things about Dora Maar, who was a sort of up and coming surrealist photographer when she met the painter Picasso, and fell in love with him, became his lover and his muse, and her sort of artistic identity was kind of being overshadowed, I suppose, by the fact that she was Picasso's lover. In 2024, there was an exhibition of her photography in London. There was a historical fiction novel, The Paris Muse, based on her life, and reading about one or the other of those, this book of poems came up, because the poem that the book's named for is about, is in the voice of Dora Maar, and basically saying to Picasso, yeah, I want my face back. The most famous image of her is painting the weeping woman, and yeah, it's like she's taken to pieces, and this is about her reclaiming herself through poetry. So good. Some of the collection was a bit patchy, but that one in particular was excellent. Now, second good collection that I read, and it was perhaps almost disappointing because I had higher expectations of this than ultimately it delivered for me, but don't tell me off, because I'll explain why. So this is Haruko Love Poems by June Jordan. Now, these poems were written, it were published in 1993 and sort of written over the sort of couple of years before that. And I wanted to read this because I just keep hearing contemporary poets and writers, particularly Black writers, queer writers, referencing June Jordan and talking about her as an influence, as a feminist, as a radical woman writer, and a special poet. And so, yeah, I thought I need to read something by June Jordan. And the poetry in this is genuinely really, really good. But my disappointment with it, perhaps, is that it's the poems in this are very personal. They're kind of, well, as you might guess from that it's love poems, and Haruko was a woman that she had a relationship with that kind of didn't end altogether happily. These poems, I could feel the quality. They're quite self-absorbed, and I suppose I was looking for the sort of the feminist political June Jordan that I'd heard about, and instead I got June Jordan, the person in a passionate and then unhappy love affair, say, and that wasn't what I was hoping for. It doesn't mean that they aren't really good poetry, but perhaps if you know June Jordan, who died in 2002, so had a long writing career. If you know a collection which might hit the spot for me better, let me know, because I could, as I say, I could feel the quality, but it wasn't what I was hoping for. Now let's move to the two collections that were absolutely brilliant from my point of view. I'm going to start with this one. Now, it's probably, can you see that? It's because it's a bit shiny and it's quite dark. It's by Femi. It's called The Wickedest. He's a British Nigerian poet. I read his first collection, Poor, and thought that was wonderful. And this is even better. It came out in 2024. He's a poet and a photographer, and you get his photographs all through the book, as well as his poems. How to describe it? It's short, but it's like it feels like an epic. Okay, it feels like an epic. It's one night at a South London house party, kind of like a private dance club night, and we taken through the whole night, and we meet the different dancers, the different DJs, the music, their relationships. It's like a kind of a sequence of timestamps almost, and a poem that expresses what was happening or how people were feeling or the atmosphere or but also that sense of belonging and identity and why it matters more than just being a fun night out to the people that come to this house party. It's, brilliant. Nothing short of brilliant. So how could I have a collection of poetry this month that for me was even more striking and memorable? Well, that's because I read this. Forest of Noise by Mosad Abu Toha. Again, it came out in 2024. Like Femi, he's a young poet. I think he's maybe not even 30 yet. He's Palestinian. This is his second collection. He's from Gaza. He was living in Gaza in October 2023. Well, I think you know what that means. These poems are poems of the Gaza conflict, and they are, it's hard to put into words, I suppose, quite how meaningful, moving, revealing this little collection of poetry is. It made me angry, it made me cry, but when I say that, you might think, well, yes, because that's, you're reading about, war poetry or poetry of sort of suffering and damage and exclusion and injustice or fear. Of course that's striking. But the point is that these are also really, really beautiful poems. He writes in English because he spent a lot of time in the States, so you're not getting it through the medium of translation. They are very, very immediate to you as the reader. It's interesting what poetry can do, isn't it? That sometimes when something is almost indescribable, unimaginable, inexpressible, in many ways, if you can put it into a poem, if you can put it into poetry, that makes that connection with the reader in a completely different way, and this did that. What more can I say? So, how to bring ourselves sort of back to the everyday from talking about that. Okay, I'm going to talk about to transition. I'm going to talk about the non-fiction book that I read this month, it's a book that I have been meaning to read for years, absolute years, because it's Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. He's a neurologist. He writes about patients that he's observed or treated. This came out in 1985. So, that's the length of time that I've been meaning to read this book. I was slightly disappointed by it. Why do I say that? It's a series of kind of little narratives about, let's say, a sequence of his patients who had unusual neurological disorders. Okay. And he writes wittily, intelligently, thoughtfully, in a very caring way. And yet, reading a book like this, it's hard to get away from that slight feeling of as a reader, you're kind of watching some sort of freak show. That's not how he writes it. That's not what he's setting out to do. He's trying to promote sort of understanding of, neurological disease, I suppose, and the variety of reminding us that the humanity within that, I suppose, despite how strange some of these sort of conditions might make people behave, or he's trying to share their experiences, and yet it left me feeling uncomfortable, slight feeling of, I don't know, should I be reading this? Should I be, an observer of this? There we go. So I think it's just on the right side of that line, but it left me feeling like maybe as a reader I wasn't on the right side. Yeah. Tell me what you think. Gareth of Books, Songs and Other Magic is also reading that this month or in February. So, maybe a few other people will be reading it, and give me your opinion. So let's get back to fiction. Let's talk about the 3 new sort of contemporary fiction novels that I read this month, all of which were good. No disappointments here. One from 2022 was Patrick Gale's novel Mother's Boy. Now, Gale's an English writer. He's written quite a number of books. I've read 3 or 4, I suppose. You're in safe hands with him. It's this book, which is most recent, is about it's kind of like a fictionalized retelling of the life of a poet, Charles Causley, who was Cornish and gay, and kind of whose life kind of follows the 20th century, in that he was sort of born just at the end of the First World War, and his father was in that war. He served in the Second World War, and then he becomes a teacher, and we kind of get his life story, and particularly his relationship with his mother, hence the title. So it's not a groundbreaking book, but it's a good one. One that carries you along. I was eager to pick it up every chance I could, and it made me want to go and read more of Causley's poetry. And it has a wonderful sense of place because of the Cornwall where Causley grew up and lived most of his life, except when he was away in World War II. So I have a good feeling about it as a book. sense of place was an even stronger quality of the next book I'm going to talk about, which is The Borrowed Hills by Scott Preston, which came out in 2024. It was Tilly and my January choice for contemporary fiction, so we will make a discussion video about this, so I won't say a load about it. It's about hill farming in Cumbria and the disaster that was the foot and mouth disease epidemic a few years back, and it's about kind of rural crime and violence and kind of toxic masculinity in a rural context, I suppose. It's quite a blokey book. I think Tilly and I will have a good time talking about it, so I will leave that there. Complete contrast, okay, with the third contemporary novel that I read this month, because it was this one, The Voyage Home by Pat Barker. So this is a book about very much about women, but it's also set long ago in a kind of a world that is somewhere between the sort of historical sort of Bronze Age and Iron Age of sort of what's now Turkey and Greece, and a sort of mythological world of Greek myth and legend, and that we get in Homer or in Greek drama and so on. So Barker this is her third book in a trilogy about the women who were embroiled in the Trojan War, and I've really invested into this trilogy, I have to say, and the book 2 and this one, book 3, I've read as a buddy read with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventure. So she's talked about this book on her channel too, and wonderful, joyous buddy reading experience. I love the book. I love Barker's style of writing. I enjoy a sort of a myth retelling, but this one, sometimes they're not always brilliant though. I like the idea of them. Sometimes they feel like pot boilers. Barker's absolutely don't. She's got fresh things to say and she says them well. So, but I won't say loads about it because it's the third book in a trilogy, and read the first one, Silence of the Girls, if you haven't yet. So the very last book I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do it fast because this is getting a bit long, was the wonderful reread that I did this month, and that was Middlemarch by George Eliot. Now, it came out in 1871-72. You don't need me, I think, to tell you to read Middlemarch. Either you've read it or you feel you ought to have read it. Is it the first George Eliot you should read if you haven't read George Eliot before? No, definitely not. I wouldn't start with this one, but because it's long and involved, and you need to come to it with a bit of patience and invest in it. But if you do, it will be one of the most rewarding novels you ever read, because Eliot writes about people and she writes about their weaknesses and their strengths, and what it means to be a person. Where does our morality kind of come into how we live? Yes, you read, it feels like all of not all of human life, because it's set in a sort of small English village, but all of human sort of human psychology is in this novel. There you go. So that was my January. As you can tell, very few kind of disappointments. Every book I read was good. I hope you had a brilliant January too. And I always love it when people come to the comments and talk about which of these perhaps they've read, or tell me your January highlights if you don't have a channel to talk about them on. And I'll be back soon.